This research was conducted by the researchers of Imperial College London in 2016. The purpose of their study was to measure the effects of LSD on the brain and on the subjective experience of the user. A little background, LSD was a very heavily researched drug in the 50s and 60s. We started researching the substance in the late 40s and continued to do so until the mid-60s. This is when people began using LSD recreationally. The drug was cheaply made, and easily distributed, which opened way for a lot of abuse of the drug. The dominant culture at the time perceived LSD to have corrosive effects on the values of the Western middle class, and more importantly, it became identified with the counterculture anti-war movement of the 1960s that swept through the UK, the US, and the Western world, which flew fundamentally in the face of the political interests and policy of those who were in power at the time. The subculture wanted to tear down old ideas and establishments, and naturally they were demonized by the campaigns that sought to demonize marijuana, LSD, and psychedelic drugs as a whole, which are all symbols of that movement. Governments banned the drug under an international treaty, and this political baggage and new red tape carried over to scientific research on the drug, which has been for the most part on pause ever since. Lysergic acid diethylamide is labeled a Schedule I drug in the UK and the US. And although technically it is not illegal to conduct studies on the drug, it's exceedingly difficult to do so, given the bureaucratic loops one must jump through and the unwillingness of traditional funders to fund it. For that reason, a large part of the study was crowdfunded by the public. It's the second most successfully funded project to date on the CrowdScience website. Robin Carhart Harris, who led this study, was the first person in the UK to administer LSD to humans for research purposes for over 40 years. Now, I'll be honest, I tried to read 32 pages of methods. Can't say that worked out, but here's what I got from it. This is the first ever study to use neuroimaging to show you what your brain actually looks like under the effects of LSD. 20 participants of good mental and physical health who had previously had experiences with psychedelic drugs and no family history of psychosis or mental illness were chosen. On 2 separate days, the participants were administered either a placebo or 70 micrograms of LSD. It was a single-blind study. Only the researchers knew what they were being given that day. At around the 70-minute mark, the peak point for the drug post-dosing MRI scans began. This included structural scans, arterial spin labeling fMRI, and bold fMRI. After a 35-minute break period, MEG scans were performed. In the scanners, participants were made to rate their subjective experiences, rating statements such as, "I felt like I was floating," "I saw geometric patterns," or "I felt afraid." These questions were designed to measure variables such as impaired cognition, simple and complex hallucination, disembodiment, the experience of bliss, and the experience of unity. These results were then correlated with the activity shown in the scans in order to gain insight into what the biological mechanisms are that underlie the experiences so commonly associated with LSD, such as disintegration of the ego, a sense of oneness with others and nature, profound hallucinatory experiences, personal insights, and so on. LSD was found to create an explosion of communication between areas of the brain that usually did not communicate, and networks that usually did communicated less. The visual cortex became much more active along with the rest of the brain. Usually information from our eyes is processed at the back of the head in the visual cortex, as you can see. However, the participants who took LSD, many additional brain areas, not just visual cortex, contributed to visual processing, which explained the hallucinations. Yet these visual hallucinations were actually found to not correlate with the drug's other characteristic effects of altering the state of consciousness. Rather, it was decreased communication between the parahippocampus and retrosplenial cortex that correlated strongly with ego dissolution and altered meaning. The retrosplenial cortex may translate between self-centered and world-centered spatial information, which would explain the feelings of oneness with the world. These discoveries expand our understanding of how the brain-mind function and how in the future we may be able to manipulate the brain using what we've learned. LSD's ability to essentially disrupt habitual patterns of communication in the brain was seen as particularly important. Many disorders like alcoholism, depression, addiction, and mood disorders are built on entrenched patterns of communication in the brain that become pathological and are difficult to deintegrate. The hope is that psychedelics may be able to be used to break down these disorders that become entrenched in pathology and core behavior by dismantling the patterns of activity by which they function. Further research must be conducted to test this hypothesis. Regardless, the study has been a hallmark in the history of psychedelic research and the potential for their use as therapeutic tools to help those who deeply suffer from the activity of their own minds. Thank you.